So I was going to talk about the timber segregation case study, and I'd like to acknowledge the two collaborators on this, Andrew Dunningham and Karen Bain, who I see have joined us. So the presentation is really broken down into two parts. The first part, I'm just going to provide some information about the forestry sector in New Zealand, because we always say the public doesn't understand a lot about forestry, and we need to explain ourselves better, so I'm going to apply that same logic to my presentation to provide some context and some understanding of the ambition for change. And then in that first half, I'm also going to just talk a little bit about how researchers have interacted with the industry in the past and what in a way has been our traditional approach to what I've called technology transfer. And then in the second part, I'm going to actually just give a very quick overview of the timber segregation case study. I'm actually a silviculturalist, as John said, so I'm very much relying on my colleagues to actually look at it as a co-innovation case study. So if I get things a little muddled, then I'm sure my colleagues will come in and help me out. So one of the big high-level visions for the forestry sector in New Zealand, as I think is probably similar for most of the primary sectors, is to look at how can we grow the value of exports. And for forestry, the challenge is to go from the current export earnings of about sort of $4.5 to $5 billion per year up to more than $12 billion. And the way that the industry needs to do that is through added value processing. If you look at the blue dotted line and the orange solid line, the orange solid line would be effectively if we continue business as usual, which would see a lot of log exports. And as we know, that's been quite political. We've been referred to as a raw log economy during the last election. We want to go beyond that and be a manufacturer of high value added products. So just to provide some context, about 58% of the forest harvest in New Zealand is exported as logs. That generates about 32% of the export value. You can see there that other industries actually generate more value proportion to the volume output. So one of the things we want to do is to move away from log exports to greater value add. So one of the things that we need to do for that to happen is to understand better the forest resource base that we have. To have the confidence for processors to invest in greater capacity, they need to know that the resource for the future is there, both in terms of the quality and the quantity. And so you can sort of see this interaction between the forest growers, the solid wood processors, and the wood and fibre and pulp processors. So a lot of the wood fibre, the pulp mills, they get their resource as residue from solid wood processing. So it's important that solid wood processing in New Zealand is profitable for a range of reasons. And one of the things that we've seen in recent years has been just the number of mill closures that have occurred. And so we've seen a consolidation of the processing capacity into fewer larger mills. And they have ambition to expand. They need to know that the resource is there to support those decisions. And we can see the industry is actually well positioned with an upswing in wood availability as a result of a lot of planting that occurred in the 1990s. But one of the challenges means that actually the wood that's going to be available to add value, it's already in the ground and growing. And a lot of it is the increase is going to be in the small private estate. So we need to know a lot more about the quality of the wood so that processors have the confidence to invest into value adding. So a big challenge for us is to be able to come up with cost-effective ways to characterise the resource, which is where we're going to get to shortly with the timber segregation case study. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of how research organisations have interacted in the past with industry. Prior to 1987, Scion, which was formerly called the Forest Research Institute, was part of the Forest Service. So we were actually embedded within the client that we were seeking to service, and so we had that direct connection. After that, when the Forest Service was disbanded, research was undertaken in cooperatives, and we had cooperatives that were based around particular issues or particular species. So the research started to become quite siloed. The cooperatives became part of an entity called Future Forest Research in 2007, and essentially these were, membership of this was voluntary. It didn't mean it was free, so the companies paid dues to become part of Future Forest Research. That was based on an area formula, so the bigger companies paid proportionally, or paid larger fees. Almost all the forest management companies in New Zealand were members. We also had a large number of consultants that were members. I think it's fair to say that it did mostly operate on a technology transfer approach to instigating change. So you could see that in the way we did things. There was a focus on producing technical reports. We had generally 2 meetings per year, where it was a 1 or 2 day meeting followed by a field trip, and we also used software as dissemination tools. And there was a little bit of criticism of the approach that often we wrote our science bids in isolation from the industry, and so it was almost a little bit of a fait accompli. And where we've tried to move away from that has been to a more co-innovation approach, which we'll talk about very soon. Another thing happened in 2014. We moved from this voluntary participation to a commodity levy. So that started on the 1st of January 2014. It is 27 cents per tonne of wood harvested. That's the rate of the levy. It has a levy trust board to administer that. About half the money collected goes to research and development. And one of the things that's happened is it's removed many of the barriers around access to research results. So in the past, there was a lot of, with Future Forest Research, there was a lot of issue around entitlement. How do we keep non-voluntary members out? Now with the levy, we've said, well, everyone's potentially a levy payer. Let's just make the research available. The other thing that's done is it has provided much more greater stability in funding, and actually it's increased the amount of industry contribution to support research. One of the things I put this in, the forest industry is often, and wood processing industry, I think to include them as well, has often been seen as fairly conservative and a group that is quite resistant to change. And this paper from a colleague at Oregon State, Eric Hansen, and co-authors has looked at the North American forestry sector and has made the comments that are in yellow. Generally, findings describing the culture of the forest sector show a conservative group that fails to sufficiently invest in innovativeness and innovation. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do within the primary innovation program is actually challenge that perception, see if that really is true. If it is true, then try and, I guess, understand a little bit more why that might be the case. And one of the challenges, particularly in forest growing, is that it is a 30-year growing cycle. Generally, a lot of the interventions occur early on, and therefore it's uncertain as to whether you get a payback at the end. The other thing is, particularly when you're talking about asset managers who are managing pension funds, it's a general thing that you don't take risks with other people's money. But what we want to do here is, I guess, try and understand that in a lot more detail. It's easy to make these kind of sweeping and somewhat superficial statements. So this is not my tree hut of the future, but I thought it would be a nice place just to stop and see if anyone has any questions so far.
Well, thanks, John. There aren't any questions at the moment, but it's a good reminder to the attendees that if you do have some questions or comments, just type them in the panel at the bottom there, and I'll be able to read them out to John. And John, can you just tell us a bit about this very impressive house in front of us? Is that in your backyard?
No, but my wife's been nagging me to build a tree house for my boys. This actually, I spent 5 years in the UK working in a group called the Centre for Timber Engineering, where we were trying to look at, it was a group actually of timber engineers and architects looking at trying to increase the utilisation of wood in the UK. And I had a colleague who was an architect. He went around photographing iconic timber buildings, and this was one that he found in the north of England, which is, to me, it's a bit like a tree hut on steroids. And he had it in one of his books, and I managed to get a copy of the image. So yeah, I can't claim a lot of credit for it, other than I like it and it's quite aspirational.
It is. It's a good example of innovativeness, isn't it? Now, John, we do have a couple of questions now. So you commented about the levy. Can you explain why the levy was introduced, please?
I think one of the industry, I think, was given a signal by the government that it needed to get itself better organised around sort of pan-industry initiatives, which also included research and development. And I think that was sort of a signal that was sent if they wanted large, highly leveraged, in other words, large component of public funding supporting them research programs, that they needed to get themselves better organised. In order to do that, they had to have a vote. There is a process in New Zealand. There is an Act of Parliament called the Commodity Levies Act. And so essentially there is a formula for sorting this out, and once, if it goes to a vote and the vote comes back as being positive, then it becomes a compulsory levy and you can't opt out.
Great. The comment's been made that it sounds like that's a huge change with the levy, and the question is, has that changed things on the ground for you, or is it going to be a long-term change?
I think there are both short and long-term benefits. I think one of the short-term things is that, one, it gave us a greater amount of money for our research. It also provided more certainty that we would have a longer-term funding stream. I think the other one, in a way, has been the entitlement issue, that we spent quite a lot of time within Future Forest Research. The research was organised thematically, so there were themes. Companies often joined one theme but not the other, and then we got into this whole shenanigans, if you want, for want of a better term, where some companies could be given access to some bits of research but not others because they didn't belong to that particular theme. So it didn't encourage sort of cross-thematic thinking. The research that potentially became quite siloed, and I think people missed out on opportunities. I think one of the things, real benefits we've seen of the levy approach is that we've very much engaged with small private growers, whereas in the past I think they probably didn't get as much attention under the old structure as the larger corporate growers did. They've got a lot more, we've engaged with them a lot more strongly under the new programs.
Very good. John, I think you touched on this, but can you just elaborate a bit more about the factors that enabled the levy to be instituted? Like, was it legislation? They're just trying to understand the mechanism that for that change.
So I think there was a lot of high-level discussion within the sector that they needed to get better organised. They were fed signals from the government that they needed to do this. But as I mentioned, the way there was a process then that was run through the Forest Owners Association. They had a public consultation and a vote, and that was all within the auspices of the Commodity Levies Act, which actually provides a framework for sectors to raise a levy on production. And we see that in a number of sectors in New Zealand. The dairy sector has it, the sheep and beef sector has it, and it supports bodies such as Dairy NZ and Beef and Lamb. So forestry was an industry that was, I guess, sitting out there a little bit by not having a levy to support a lot of these industry good activities.
That's good.
Is supporting is this our big research program called Growing Confidence in Forestry's Future. So we receive about just over 20 million from the Ministry for Business Innovation and Employment, which is the main funding body, science funding body in New Zealand. And it's a 6-year program. We also get a $9.6 million from the Forest Growers Levy. And our big goal is to improve the productivity and sustainability of the forestry sector. So we want to build more productive, resource-efficient forests that provide the raw material base for value-added processing. So as I showed in the very first slide, the real gain in export value will not come from just growing more raw logs. it will actually come from the value that we can add to them. So we want to grow, I guess, more better wood if that's not murdering the English language. So the drivers for the program, I imagine people who are working in other Crown Research Institutes are very similar. A lot of it's driven by, here on the right, the business growth agenda for New Zealand, which is about building export markets. When we're only a country of 4 and a bit million people, a lot of we want to increase the proportion of gross domestic product that comes from exporting things. So our domestic market's relatively small, so we need to grow our export market. So what we're trying to do is essentially provide that raw feedstock that enables people to make products from our main species, radiata pine, that can be internationally competitive and will sell on the international market. So we have an overarching strategy for the forest sector, which is the Woodco Strategic Action Plan. That was the ambition for change I showed earlier. And then the forest growers have their Science and Innovation Plan, which talks about productivity, consistency of wood properties, and sustainability. So that's the main thing that we're trying to address in the program. What we are doing is, within this, we are taking part of the program and using it as our ex-ante case study, and we've loosely called this timber segregation. There's a bit of a mouthful here. We structured our program around a number of key hypotheses, and I guess the aim is to either confirm or refute those hypotheses. And so the particular one that relates to this program is that we're saying that cost-effective segregation methods that deal with the internal or the intra and inter-tree variation in wood properties will improve the utilisation of the current resource. So in layman's terms, if we better understand the properties of the resource that we have, and we can develop cost-effective ways to separate the material, that will help us to add value to it. One of the challenges is that this isn't a universally held view. There's a perception from many that segregation just adds cost. One of the things that's also important to understand in the New Zealand forestry sector is that we don't have necessarily that many vertically integrated companies. So we've often, with the breakup of the Forest Service and the larger corporates, we've separated forest growing from wood processing in many cases. So it's often the ability to capture the value of decisions means that what might be beneficial for a processor isn't necessarily beneficial for a grower. So, and that's the argument here, that if we do segregation, the benefits will accrue to the processor and not the grower. It just becomes a cost to the grower. The logistics of segregation make it difficult. If you're talking about log segregation, if you have more piles, you need more space to put those logs, and particularly in hilly terrain, that becomes difficult with resource management and cost issues, because you need to bulldoze more dirt effectively. Big challenge is, how do you quantify the benefits of segregation? People will argue, well, actually, it just basically creates more havoc, and what it might do is it might result in higher prices for the better logs, but to balance that out, there'll be lower prices for the poorer logs, and actually the mean will just stay exactly where it is. And then also other people say, well, actually wood quality doesn't matter. If we're just exporting raw logs to China, the value is really just grow as much wood as you can, as quickly as you can, and get it to the market as quickly as possible. So the 3 V's, value equals volume times velocity. So that's been some of the challenges. And it's really, I guess, symptomatic of the fact that not everyone is connected along the value chain. We've got quite a we've got a number of different value chains or value chains in New Zealand. We've got just the raw log value chain, we've got the processed in New Zealand value chain, and we've got the separation between growers and processors. So it's not like the dairy sector where, you know, largely you've got your growers having to supply to a milk factory. Here they can't. It would be analogous to individual farmers getting together and sending raw milk overseas. That's sort of what's going on in the forestry sector with log exports. The other thing too is that people have different views on quality, and that's been one of the challenges, is that feedback signals don't always pass back down through the chain. So a forestry company might think that a fine specimen is a tall, straight, fat tree with small branches, but for a wood processor and for a customer, that's immaterial effectively if the wood twists and warps all over the place when you process it. So just in order to just sort of test things, who's actually tried to build something out of timber?
So this is where you can now raise your virtual hand. So if you've built something out of timber, can you just quickly raise your hand? Well, I know I have, John, because I built a cubby house for my kids out the back. It wasn't a tree house, but it was a cubby house. But the little blighters have hardly used it, I confess. So we now store leftover materials out there now.
Yeah, so that's my experience.
Yeah, and I can see a couple of people have raised their hands. So yes, I think a number of us have done it.
Yeah, so this was my experience. You know, we had a timber customer just about reduced to tears by poor wood quality. I saw this wonderfully twisted piece of 4x4 lumber, and we're asking the question, how am I going to get square sides on my sandpit with this piece of timber? So it might have come from a perfectly straight tree, but it's not a perfectly straight piece of timber. So yeah, quality is in the eye of the beholder. So where we're sitting in is one of the primary innovation case studies. I guess it is seen as being, you know, heading towards being a complex problem because the knowledge is contested and it's also relying on getting together, spanning quite two groups within the value chain to really create change here. So we've put our head on the block. So I think you're all aware why we're doing these case studies. So I've always got to remember to, as a biophysical scientist, to actually sort of think, well, this case study is not just actually the science that we're doing. We're actually trying to say, is taking a co-innovation approach actually going to deliver more impact than if we just did a traditional sort of tech transfer approach? And as we all know, it's action research. Karen is the reflexive monitor. She's the person who's watching over what's going on and providing feedback and input. And also Andrew's providing sort of co-learning theory and advice on this as well, and is also looking at how things are going. So one of the things that we've done that's quite a change from the previous way we've done things is to actually create what we've called an innovation cluster. So within the Growing Confidence in Forestry's Future program, we've actually created 4 of these, but this particular one is the subject of the case study. So we've actually created a product quality improvement cluster. And the big focus of this has been to work towards a shared understanding of the issues so that it's not a sort of tech transfer, let's just push the technology up a pipe and then sort of hope, pray, whatever, that it will get taken up by the industry and will make a difference. That what we're actually trying to do is make sure that we have a deep understanding of the issues. We're also creating a landing pad for innovation, and that we're also ensuring that all the structures and functions necessary for innovation to occur they're either present or they're being developed. So if there are critical pieces missing or in terms of people or functions, that we can work to address that, because the increase in resource availability is going to come on us quite quickly. It's effectively, if we don't do something in the short term, it will be a major lost opportunity for the sector. And as I've mentioned before, there are a number of challenges with segregation. I guess from a science perspective, we've always typically focused on the technical challenges. You know, 2 of them are essentially finding metrics that are correlated with end product quality. So that's trying to understand what site and stand factors and tree shape factors, or developing tools that can assess different attributes, and then finding out how well correlated they are with end product quality. And then another challenge is making this as cheap, being able to make these measurements as cheaply and as quickly as possible. Probably the biggest challenges I could see, not that the technical challenges are simple, are actually the organisational and cultural challenges. As I mentioned, we have a fragmented value chain, so we have growers and processors. A big challenge is actually how do you share the benefits between the parties. If a benefit occurs to the processors because they get better quality logs, they get fewer rejects, and therefore they get greater value. How do they then turn around and share those benefits with the forest grower who provided the better quality material? You know, it only seems fair if you grow a better product, you should be rewarded for it. Another challenge is actually how do you implement segregation within operations? So it has to be, you have to understand the way that the industry works, the processes that go on from essentially harvesting stands and processing them into logs and grading, and how do we do that? How do we do it more efficiently? And we have to maybe go back and say, well, are the log grades that we have for New Zealand that were developed nearly 30 years ago, are they actually appropriate? Do we need to change those? If we do need to change them, what is the mechanism by which we do that? That would have to take quite a lot of cooperation right across the industry and also with our customers who buy the logs. And then I think one of the big things is actually, you know, what is the driver for change? How do we actually get people to change from business as usual? It's the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But when you when you talk to forest processors, they say that we lose a lot of money with our poor, out-of-spec logs. So but creating that framework where we can have a dialogue between growers and processors, I think, starts to help to create that driver for change. From a research, from a primary innovation research perspective, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, I just wanted to put it up there to show that we've actually created the log frame for this, for our case study, where we're looking at, you know, some of the issues, the inputs in terms of you know, funding, resources, etc. Some of the outputs that we're planning to create, and some of the impacts that we are trying to create in the short, the mid, and the long term. And so one of the big changes again in our research is that in the past with technology transfer, we often focused on outputs. We're very much more focused now on impacts and understanding what we need to do to create the impacts that we want to, which again is the focus of primary innovation. Can we go, through taking this approach, can we go faster or can we go higher? And so one of the big things has been to bring to bring forest growers and processors together to create an increased awareness by growers that wood quality matters. There was the perception that we can just send it to China and they'll take any old bit of wood. And then we worked down some of the other things that we want to do in terms of doing some case studies around particular sectors, getting forest growers to understand what drives wood quality variation so that when they start planting their next generation of forest, they can create a better crop. And also as researchers, that we actually have a better understanding of the industry's issues and concerns. And there's just some examples. The other thing that we've done is Karen has done a social network analysis for this particular area. We did this at the start of the project, and what we want to do is look at how our social network changes over time. Have we got all the people, all the structures and functions for a good innovation system present? So have we got the right people? At the moment, what we can see is because it's essentially starting to, it's emerged from the research program, it tends to be fairly heavily clustered. I don't expect you to know the names, but I'm just drawing a circle around the people who in a way are the key wood quality researchers, as well as maybe some of the key people in industry. But what was interesting for me was that there were some people around the periphery here that I was actually quite surprised that were sort of connected to the project. And so I think what we obviously want to do is understand more about these connections and also figure out, I guess, how we can strengthen and solidify this network. So that's been a useful benchmark for this project. And I think, you know, I don't think it's something that we've ever done for a research project, certainly deliberately before. And just wanted to finish on, because we can't get into all the detail, but one of the really tangible outputs, I think, or outcomes that we've achieved so far, while it might seem a little trivial, has been actually that there's been a big swing, a big shift in the thinking in the industry in terms of the fact that actually wood quality matters. So I guess what it's created is legitimacy for what we're doing, that people actually now recognise that wood quality is important. And this isn't my diagram. This came from I remember I showed the forest growers research strategy. That was actually dated 2012. They've now produced a new, a revised strategy, and this diagram was actually in the revised strategy, which came directly from our research to say that the common priorities between forest growers and wood processors are understanding the wood quality of the current crop, the wood quality of the future crop, and the development of quality screening and segregation tools. So I think, you know, we've worked very hard to try and create legitimacy for what we're doing, and I think, you know, one of the outcomes that we've seen has been this change in thinking. And in fact, the thing that was really gratifying is they actually asked for a wood quality image for their cover for a forest grower strategy. So I think we are, you know, taking small steps, but we are making a difference. So just some concluding comments. I think one of the challenges for the work that we're doing is that we're spanning the gap between growers and processors, and bear in mind that our research is co-funded by a forest grower levy and not by a forest processor levy, that we're having to work kind of outside our sort of core funding base, so to speak, but clearly there's a vested interest in having growers and processors come together. I think what I've found is that this co-innovation approach is very helpful in building a shared understanding and creating a network to enable change. It's new for us. It is a significant move away from, I guess, what the traditional approach, which is almost the build it and they will come. And I think that as a result of doing this, I think we're actually working on the things that will actually make a difference for the industry. We understand a lot more what their needs are. It's still a work in progress. I think, you know, it does take a big commitment in terms of time. We're still embedding these concepts into the forestry sector. As I mentioned, we've got 4 innovation clusters. There's another 3 outside the one that I've been talking about. But I think right across the board that we're seeing that early results are extremely promising, and the feedback from the industry in terms of the engagement with Scion is very positive, and they're seeing a lot of early benefits from the research that we're doing. So here's this is what really happens when people have to make decisions around logs. This is log segregation in action. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thanks, John. A few questions here for you. So the first one is, can you just clarify, is this a cooperative model, and can one reasonably expect that all stakeholders share in the benefits from the innovation across all stakeholders?
I guess what we're talking about, these clusters are they are a loose grouping of people who I think have a vested interest in the problem. And so I think part of that is actually understanding their drivers as much as anything, so that from a co-innovation or from an innovation perspective, we might understand what some of the impediments to change are. You know, if something's, you know, potentially has a negative impact on someone's business, they're going to be reluctant to change. But if having them change would make create bigger benefit for the wider sector, then we need to look at mechanisms for how we can enable them to change their practice and reward them for doing so. So I'm not sure if that quite answers the question, but yeah, the clusters are essentially, in a way, it's a voluntary grouping. It isn't a cooperative, but we are trying to create cooperation along the value chain.
Okay, that's great. And a question here. So, you know, thanks for sharing your learning so far, but what's been your greatest learning so far, and what stood out for you in terms of the co-innovation model?
I think for me, I started out with an idea in my head what I sort of meant by segregation, and by having some of these discussions with different parties, I realised that actually there is possibly, my thinking has evolved over time, and I think what I perceive to be the problem, there are other ways of cracking it. And actually, when I was thinking initially log segregation, being able to characterise logs through sort of information that a colleague came up with, he's actually shown that probably the biggest benefit is stand level segregation. And when we start to talk to some of the wood processors, their biggest concern is actually finding stands of trees with the attributes that they need. And so we've been able to sort of we've been able to be malleable with our research, whereas in the past we may have just tried to get to a solution. You know, we've finished this piece of software, we've written this report, or we've made this presentation. So I think, you know, we're starting to become a lot more malleable and flexible. So that for me has been, you know, it's not to say that we never finish anything. It's just showing that we've actually got bits of research that we can pull from different parts of the program to actually solve the problem. So I think we've been a lot more agile and dynamic with what we do.
Good. Okay. Now Dennis has jumped in and made a few comments that I'll just read out to you. So he's commenting that it's interesting that the industry challenges about the quality, you know, / volume has quite a lot of similarity to the dairy industry, where you produce a commodity for offshore processing or process in New Zealand. And he says that the evidence is mixed for dairy. And then he goes on, I think, to share the New South Wales view. So in Australia, on the other hand, it's focused on branded products into a mostly domestic product, into a domestic market. The percentage of Australian dairy products that has been exported has continually dropped since 2000, while production has also dropped. And he goes on to say that it's logical to assume that although the New Zealand dairy industry has focused on volume, we've focused on value. This too is not true. So from New South Wales, New Zealand has created more value from a lower value product than Australia has from a higher value and branded product. And in the last financial year, we left 1.15 billion US dollars on the table in lost value. Even in New South Wales terms, we left 90 million US dollars sitting there. Our opportunity to learn is to regain that value. Any comments on that, John?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because one of the, well, I could probably ask several streams of that question. I think one of the big issues for the forestry sector is that we spend 28, 30 years creating value by growing a tree. We haven't we've put a lot of research into that. We haven't really followed that up with actually understanding then how do we capitalise on that, you know, intermediate value that we've created. So, you know, where are we losing value along the value chain? It probably is a case that there are some logs that are better exported and sent overseas, for example, to China, because of their lower labour costs. They can actually they can afford to spend the time extracting value out of those logs that with our labour costs we probably can't. But then there are other products, other mills, particularly though, you know, just using an example of high quality appearance mills, where they can create a lot of value from high quality pruned logs. And they are quite significant businesses in New Zealand, particularly in sort of regional economies. So I think it's a mix, and one of the things is I don't think that New Zealand can process every single piece of wood that we grow onshore to create value. There is definitely a market and a need, I think, to have a log export industry. It also helps us deal with fluctuations in wood availability. And it may be that the New Zealand mills would struggle to be internationally competitive to try and process those lower grade logs onshore. But certainly we're seeing significant expansion. There's a mill here in Rotorua that's going to significantly increase its production, and it's going to use a lot of reasonably good quality structural logs. So that's a good sign.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'll just finish with this last question for you. So how difficult has it been for you to demonstrate the tangible benefits, and what evidence do you draw on? And by benefits, they mean the log segregation as a technology.
It is challenging in some ways. You know, often we can have small studies, for example, that if we could, using one technology, if we could sort veneer logs, we can show that it creates a benefit for a mill. That's a very sort of almost microcosm of what's going on. One of the things we've been working with colleagues, and we have a value chain group, and they're just starting to look at some of these ideas around discrete event simulation, where you can actually use these tools to model the value chain and actually try and quantify the benefits of these interventions. That's actually one of the other streams of our research, is not just the sort of biophysical side of things, but it's actually also the economics and of the supply chain, so that we can we can actually show the impact of these decisions, because I think part of the thing is a lot of our ability to articulate these things in the past, and probably even right now, isn't that good. And so we've actually realised that in order to get people to really take this up or to change, is that we've got to work hard to research the benefits of doing things differently. So we've done a lot of work on just characterising wood quality and developing segregation tools, but we've actually done less on the whole kind of techno-economic component to show why you might want to do this and what you would gain from doing it.
Good. And Dennis has just made a further comment too, saying that from his perspective, the value of the co-innovation process is getting the industries to think together to crack that value, the value opportunities, and that this provides guidance for the biophysical work.
That's correct. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you for your presentation, John. I'll now pass over to Denise.
Thanks, John, and I want to say thanks again to John Moore. That was just a brilliant presentation. We were commenting, I've got a couple of people here at our end here in Lincoln, and we were just saying how clear it is, and just gave us a really good overview of what you guys are trying to do with the Log Segregation Innovation Project. So thank you so much, really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who joined us for the Primary Innovation webinar. It's great to have you here. Next month on the 1st of October, Thursday the 1st of October, we're going to hear from Tracy Williams and her team at Plant and Food Research on the TPP, Tomato Potato Psyllid Innovation Project. Now, just one clarification with the next webinar, it will only be open to primary innovation participants because they're going to be talking about some stuff in the industry that is specific to that industry, and so I'll make that clear in the invitation, but usually we try to encourage you to send out the invitation far and wide. Next month we won't be doing that, but then we'll be back on track in November to do that. So thanks for joining us. I know there's been a few people huddled around computers, so often there's more people than the numbers that show on the webinar. And finally, thanks John James, thank you. We really appreciate your help with running these webinars, and the glitches are never never really that any problem. So thank you so much, John, for organising the webinars and making them run so smoothly. We really appreciate that, and enjoy the rest of your day.